Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Enterprise Dish. Unlike the past two episodes, well, maybe even three episodes, actually, that have been on the road, this one is back in the studio, back at home, finally. But we got Mr. Aaron hanging out with us today, still up in Seattle, who had well, we're not drinking Bloody Marys this time, but I still think...
As far as you know.
Yes, I think we're going to have a good time today. How's it going, man?
It's going well, going well. It's been, it was a super warm May and first part of June, and we're kind of back into a little Seattle gloom. But, you know, things are busy as always, and, you know, no shortage of interesting topics to discuss, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you know what? Let's just dive right in, because if people are listening to this, this is going to impact you potentially as early next week. Microsoft warned us that they were going to be just shoving out 1903 in the month of June. They didn't really say when. They said, hey, we finished it up at the end of May, and then we're just going to hit a button, and everyone's just going to start getting it installed, like it or not. And we'll talk a little bit more about update woes here. But everyone should be on the lookout for that, because it is going to be coming hot and heavy. And if you're not prepared, well, then you're unprepared, and that's never a good situation.
Right. And, you know, kind of talking this through with our team, it seems to be working okay. Mm-hmm. You know, when you read about it on the web, and for the most part, yeah, it seems to be going okay. But there are a couple of these little hidden gems of not awesomeness in 1903, and some listeners probably have heard about this. I don't know if you've heard about some of the hardware-based encryption problems with storage devices. So apparently, a couple of manufacturers have a flaw in their hardware encryption, and basically allows you to sideload malicious bad stuff. And you know, it's sort of another one of these wild Windows things where Microsoft didn't address it initially, and then everyone was complaining about it. And then in May, I think they did, but it wasn't documented, or I don't know if maybe it was in 1903 and not documented, but basically they just changed the default setting with the GPO. So if the hardware device, and I think this is right, and listeners and watchers, please verify independently, and this is all over the internet, I'm sure, very easy to discover. But if you have a device that is capable of hardware-based encryption, Windows used to say, yes, do it by default, use that. They flipped it in 1903, but so by default, the GPO set is just exactly the opposite. And one of the blogs has like a nice side-by-side screenshot. One of the old way that is on by default, and one of the new way, which is off by default. And so it takes a little bit of doing. And so I guess aside from sort of the 1903 gotcha, it's also another example, right, in sort of this cautionary way of, you know, don't just take everything at face value, and it is worth testing, especially these bigger releases, and you know, find a sample group, roll it out, make sure nothing weird happens. When something weird happens, you know, you don't just have to face palm all day long. It might be a simple thing, and flip the switch in the GPO and everything works fine. But in this case, it should fix things, but then you can't assume that your hardware-based encryption is going to work properly. You've got to do software by default. Yeah,
and that is a very big change for certain demographics. If you're that concerned about encryption and everything else and keeping that data locked down, this is something you absolutely must be aware of, because it's going to change up the schematics of your protection layer of that data.
For sure. You know, think about healthcare and financial services and these other environments where they really have a requirement to run that kind of security. And then if your assumption is that your, you know, hardware manufacturer, you're trusting that the devices that you procure are going to be set up properly, you might get a funny little surprise. The upside is, though, that the surprise is that it won't work. Meaning Windows, I think, throws some wild errors and weird problems, and then you're sort of just trying to unwind these weird problems and troubleshoot through Windows, as opposed to just having it work and thinking it's a status quo and being unprotected. That's not necessarily the case here, fortunately. But it is a great lesson learned in the sense that, again, we've got sort of these weird anomalous issues creeping in that may or may not be very well documented. In this case, to my knowledge, no documentation, but for the explosive TechNet threads and people's blogs and everyone sort of going off about sort of these unusual behaviors related to this. So
yeah, I mean that is that is absolutely just something. It just fascinates me because to me that's not an issue, right? It doesn't bother me at all. Fine, encryption, whatever. But to your exact point, you've got all these little minor changes that Microsoft might just be like, whatever, have deep, serious ramifications depending on the target audience.
Yeah, and so for a lot of us that play in this world where, whether it's a GDPR driven, going back, in fact, our last discussion, I think we talked about this a little bit from a security and privacy compliance perspective. If you serve large organizations that have global customers, even if you're just a small shop that does local or regional business, but you've got large customers, they're going to hold your feet to the fire.
Yep.
And as they hold your feet to the fire, all of a sudden you're in the same boat as all the enterprise customers. Or even if you're a freelance freelance graphic designer, it's just you and a couple other people who are sweating in every Adobe product made, and you think everything's fine. Well, all of a sudden your clients are telling you have to do this. Okay, that's fine. Those are the people who are going to be stymied by this, right? Oh, why won't it work? Why can't I log in? Why is this not booting properly? Whatever might be going on. So that's sort of the gotcha of some of these issues. And I guess this phenomenon of the unstated change that is really going to turn into a curveball that's going to consume cycles. So as the single person shop or the small shop, the small agency, or even the mid-sized organization that relies on an MSP, this is a great chance to test the mettle of your MSP. How sharp are they? How dialed in are they on the endpoint management side, right?
Yeah, that's a very fair point.
So it's a great opportunity to make sure and validate that you've got the right people, and if you don't, take them to task. That would be my advice, and ask them why they aren't aware and what they're doing to stay on top of these kinds of things. That's sort of
that's a really interesting aspect, because to your point, a lot of smaller shops just outsource that information because it's the right move for those people. But at the same time, you're also depending on their trust that they know their stuff better than you could, just doing it nights and weekends. So that's,
absolutely right. And they may or may not be that tuned into these kinds of issues as well, right? Your assumption is, they know everything. And that's a very errant assumption. And I suppose most of us wouldn't ever believe that our MSP knows everything, but they know enough about all the things that matter that they're going to keep me out of trouble, keep me compliant, and above all, keep us productive and working. And they may or may not. Those people are very, very busy. They have many, many clients just like you, and they're working diligently on a variety of problems. If you're large enough, they might be beholden largely to you and focused on your environment, and not necessarily putting their head up to look around and say, okay, what else is going on with this next round of updates? They may or may not be testing for you, and that may be something that you have to pay them more for, meaning doing the things that large mature IT organizations do, like identifying a test group, rolling out a patch early to that test group, or a major revision to that test group to verify, validate, and ensure you're not going to have any of these gotchas. So, it's a good call to action, I think, and it's the right time for even mid-sized and smaller organizations to be thinking about those kinds of compliance issues, and based on the way that you manage your IT infrastructure, playing that into your hand.
Yeah, and speaking of updates here, I got a fun little story. Or I shouldn't even say fun, because it was detrimental to
unfun
many hours on a weekend. So this podcast box that we are recording on right now, unbeknownst to me, was stuck on 1709, which is what was released in September or October of 2017. And I'd seen it run through all the update stuff, and I just kind of assumed that it was working correctly because I would see it says, "Hey, we're installing updates." I'd just go upstairs, eat my lunch or whatever, and just come back and all that. And so then when 1903 came out, as we've talked about previously, it allows you to defer updates and push things off for up to 18 months or whatever it is. And that got me really excited because I want this box updated the least. I want the patches on Patch Tuesday, but I don't want the feature updates. I want to delay this stuff because this is a production box. I don't want anything to change because it makes my life a nightmare. So I go to install this update in it, and I realized I was still on 1709, and everything had been failing up to this point. And the crux of this argument is that when it failed, the error message was quite literally, it says, something went wrong, and it says, here is your error code, 0x800-700-652, which tells you nothing. And Windows has been around, and you're probably more experienced than I am, since 1985. And that is the best error message that Microsoft could come up with.
Right, that's the new error message.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I mean?
And so you take this error message, and the first thing probably anybody on the planet does is you copy that string of text, you go to Google, and you paste it in. And here's the great part. It was like the first 7 or 8 entries were not related to Microsoft. There was one, I think, Microsoft Answer Forum reply, but nothing that really told you of anything of value. And so once you finally figure out what you're supposed to do, it is a cryptic mess. Here is where, if anybody runs into this problem, here is the folder and location of the file that you have to find to actually begin triaging what happens. It is C:$Windows $B2/sources/Panther, which we'll get to that in a minute because why Panther, and then /compat-cache.dat. That is where you ultimately, that is what the error message should link to. It should link to that file, not this cryptic code, because what happens is once you get into the Panther folder, which by the way I learned from a Microsoft insider was the name of the update mechanism designed for Windows Vista was named Panther. That is why it's still called Panther. You get to a very funky looking file that says driver package has signed binaries true, block mitigation true or false. And so you look for the ones that say true, and it tells you OEM121.inf. That's what it tells you. That's what the triage tells you. And of course, what do you do with that? Well, then you have to go to cwindows/inf and you find that file number and you double click it. And what does it tell you? What was blocking my stuff? Printers. And so what you have to do is then you have to go into Windows features and files, Windows feature additions part of Windows, unselect those features, delete the cache, and then everything updates fine. So I got my machine updated, but my rant, or whatever you want to call it, is that all the information that I needed to solve my problem was already on my machine in a very, granted, this is not a discoverable way, but it was all there. And somebody could just put a deep link to that file structure and just make this cryptic error message 99% easier to triage. And yet, here we are with Windows.
Right, and I think it's sort of related to what I was saying earlier, which is, here are all these tucked away things, and how do you figure it out but for sort of this brute force and believing that the internet has all the answers, which maybe sort of it did in this case. I think as I think about this and sort of playing devil's advocate, who are those error messages for, right? Yeah. Meaning specifically the whatever it is, 1x09, whatever that little string of characters was that describes what happened. Who is that for? That's not necessarily, I don't think, for you and me. That's for you and me to share with our IT organizations or directly to Microsoft support. And then if we're in an enterprise setting or in a business setting, then our IT people would then call support and bring that to them, and they'd be like, oh, here's what you got to do. Yeah. Right. There's sort of, I think, a legacy belief that you're going to execute the problem solving in a very specific way. And I think Microsoft deliberately doesn't want to say, oh, here's what broke, now go ahead and go fix it. I think the risk for them is, the average person is probably going to cause even more problems and muck up Windows even more. Yeah, that's right. You get into these obscure hidden locations, right? Think about registry hacks. Oh, yeah. The source of all evil, right? If you don't do it exactly right, you're going to blow up everything and you're going to have to start over, right? Which is why so many organizations now have these kind of flatten and reload policies, right? That after so many minutes,
Yeah.
It's, turns into this whole thing. So it's a bit of a slippery slope, right? I mean, I don't think that the way it is ideal,
Hmm.
but how far should they take it? Is it safe? The old Star Trek adage, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So people like you and me probably can muck around and figure it
Yep.
out, and if we do any harm, probably unwind it and get back at least to the semi-broken but still mostly functional state we were
Hmm.
in. Hack around printer issues. Yeah, that's sort of not that big of a deal. My parents, oh man,
Yeah.
you give them a phishing link and they'll click on it, right?
Hmm.
They're the worst at those kinds of things. So I think that there's a massive audience that we have to figure out. So what would be interesting though is to have a dial on the error reporting, so
Yeah.
that if you're using a certain version or edition of Windows, that you get the more enlightened,
Hmm.
self-support. Or on the install, you can choose, hey, here's the way I want to do this.
Yep.
That's also hugely risky. But sort of just thinking out loud about this problem, yeah, it's not great, and it's super frustrating because all you do is you just want it to work, right? And the expectation is it's going to work.
Yeah.
But this is exactly part of the reason I think that our business is growing, is that this, you had a problem with some printer that, either Microsoft couldn't foresee or did foresee, and then the manufacturer of that printer maybe changed, and you got a driver update between the time that, Microsoft last ran test and it was released, and you installed your driver, and all of these variables are replaced simultaneously.
Hmm.
So then our customers come back to us and say, hey, fix it, which we do for them, and they go on merrily because they don't have to call Microsoft and deal with that rodeo, or fix it themselves.
Yep.
and have the facepalm over and over that you did. Right. I mean, it's not great for sure.
No.
It's not great, but
No.
what do you do?
Yeah, and you do raise a very fair point that there is a large swath of audience that should never tinker in the Panther folder, if you will.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And who should never know why it's named that, or
Yes.
or hey, what is this funny code name that sounds a lot like an Apple code name, right? Why are we naming
Mhm.
things cat names, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And how we're nerdy enough to even know that in the first place is sort of embarrassing. But that, 95, 99, 99.9% of the Windows using universe would never go there, right?
Yeah.
And don't care. And really just would then pick up the phone or work around it, or give up and go and buy a Mac, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's
Or Chromebook or an
those are
iPad. Yeah.
those are sort of the paths, right? And that's the risk,
Mhm.
to a large extent. However, for us, at least for me, we're concerned about business users who, have IT people who are like you and me and our
Yep.
listeners, and who would dig in and probably figure it out and solve it. And you're the good citizen who's blogging about it and saying, here's the fix, right? And making the world a better place. Just as with this device encryption, hardware-based encryption
yeah.
problem, same thing. Some good citizens out there started raising their voices, and the thread on TechNet got miles long, and Microsoft addressed it, and another blogger posted the side by side, and we can now laugh about it and things. But this is, I think, for better or worse, how the world works, and in a way is what makes this modern model of kind of ongoing and more frequent rapid iteration and constant release a possibility, is that there are enough of us doing this that we sort of, in a backwards way, enable the behavior, maybe
Yeah.
in a not so great way, as embarrassing as it may be to admit that
Mhm.
that we're enabling that. But that's also sort of what the Insiders program is about, is it gives a channel for Microsoft to say, hey, here it is, tell us what's broken, right? And when they don't let it marinate long enough, or so many of us are like, oh yeah, this little thing's broken, but all you have to do is this, and everybody knows that, and it
Yeah.
seems to be fine, and no one's reporting it. That's when you get these mega problems that files disappear and what have you. So I don't know, man. It's sort of a funny new world,
It
right?
is. It is, especially with then you toss in features updates, and Microsoft's they've just got some decisions to make about how they want to kind of, I don't want to say triage proof things, but they've got to allow you to help yourself for the audience that wants to do it. But there's a slippery slope. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, release readiness, right? In a way, it comes down to part of the question, and how the process has gone from the very, very old way. Things had to be packaged. You had to distribute media. Those days are over. We're in this brave new world, and there's still experimentation going on, I think is very fair to say. And we're not going to have things in a steady state, I think, for potentially years more, in part because this ecosystem is so vast and is changing so rapidly. Devices are changing, use cases are changing, security and privacy standards are changing. All of this turns into a really, really complex mix of things that have to be addressed all at once. And so you have to prioritize, right? Microsoft is a very, very large, very rich organization, but they still only have the resources that they have, right? There's a lot of stuff going on under that hood. And again, to some of our earlier conversations, it is an absolute miracle that it works. It's a miracle that we're having this conversation right now. Right. And where I believe we're both using Windows devices, it's perfectly magic. Right. And so is it ideal? No, it's really not ideal. It's still quite stunning. It's like an airplane. Right, Brad? I mean, that's how I think about it. The airport, so frustrating. Oh, it just motivates me to want to fly private. But even that's not perfect. OK, so you get through and the boarding process and all of that. This aluminum tube goes whatever 100 miles an hour and flies. Let's not forget that it is a miracle that we're flying and not crashing more, right? So that's sort of how I think about Windows and really IT in general, and especially sort of the modern state of IT and the way the cloud works and all these things is more good than bad. I still remain an optimist. As frustrated as you were with that problem, right, you were able to get to an issue. I don't know, how long did it take you to figure out that issue?
That was probably 3 hours. 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon.
So a half a day. You lost half a day of your life to that problem. How much has having your device functioning well saved you even since the time you fixed that, right? Probably
absolutely.
3 hours versus going, 10 years ago tech or whatever, no tech at all, right? This wouldn't really be possible.
Yeah, this whole orchestration. I mean, this machine is solely dedicated to podcasting. To go from a power off state to the state we're in right now, I've got it down to like 3 minutes.
Right.
But I mean, that's to your point though. Like it's a small miracle that I can hit the power button. I have the apps auto open and get right to where they need to be. Basically, the longest part is honestly typically waiting for Skype to open and then getting it on the monitors set up correctly, because Skype won't remember the window framing that I always set every time. But that's the point. And then we hit record, and then we're off and running.
Right. Yeah, it's really a funny thing, and sort of the way that we went from these single purpose devices, right? So to capture video in days of old, we would have some kind of camera that just was a camera that only did that thing, and maybe it was a specialized broadcast camera. So we now we're buying this highly specialized single purpose device, and so now we have this sort of expectation that we can use these very multi-purpose, right? Every purpose device that's going to do everything we expect, essentially instantaneously, on demand, and without error. And I think that, to a large extent, we're capable of doing that now, which is just phenomenal. So yeah, I think more good than bad, but that doesn't make the IT person's job or life easier or better, especially because those of us in this world, we live with the problems, right? You're like the manager at the restaurant who gets all of the complaints. So your world is complaints, right? And you're always having to be, the bad cop and the tough manager who's calling you out on whatever, a dirty utensil or food showing up cold or, whatever the case might be. And that's the same thing with IT, is it all seems dark, which I think explains a lot of the disposition of of us and our colleagues who aren't necessarily always the most chipper people in the world, and it's for a very good reason, right? We're dealing with these printers interfering with all these other problems in a stupid folder named Panther.
Yep.
Right. I mean, there's got to be a better way. That's what you're thinking at the time. But I try to encourage everyone, and I sort of I try to bring the bright light of the miracle of flight back into the frame and say, look, things are running better.
Yep.
And fortunately for many of us, the cloud makes it a lot better because we're outsourcing all those problems, right? There are other great people, wherever at Microsoft and Amazon and VMware and IBM and Oracle who are making our lives easier because they're dealing with the problems. Those problems still exist for those people. Exchange, for example. Microsoft deals now with, we've outsourced our Exchange problems, right? And that's at the end. But knowing people on the Exchange team, there are still problems, and there is high drama, right? And that there is a massive apparatus built now around that. So it's sort of an interesting time.
Funny enough, to draw the connections together, I don't like flying through clouds because then you're typically rocking and rolling. But all good.
Apt metaphor.
Exactly. A couple quick things here on the back side of the book. I'll just call them out. Dell, for some reason, made up a new SKU of Windows 10 that was populating around, and I got pinged about 1 million times, called Windows 10 Ultra. That is not a thing. So if you see that on any of their marketing documents, Windows 10 Ultra is, you can ignore that.
Right, an unthing.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of a fabricated figment of that came off a marketing person's desk.
Yep.
So is that dying? Like, did they officially kill it, or is that going to continue to be like a Dell coined?
I hope so. Here's what happened: was it showed up on a SKU for a new laptop that I think is shipping sometime around back to school time, and every Microsoft journalist on the planet pinged Microsoft, and they said that's not a thing. So I don't think Dell's going to keep running with it. I'm hoping that was just an honest marketing mistake that made it all the way into advertisements and publications, but we will see.
Yeah, someone probably got in a lot of trouble for that.
I think so too.
And I think the brand cops down the street from us here are probably furious.
They probably are.
So yeah, I'm sure probably what happened there. OEMs have a nice kit, right? Of course, and many of us kind of monkey with some of that ourselves, and so that's probably what they did is they magicked up their own preload and bolted it into the printers. Your magic printer problem, right, was probably end around it, and that might be why it does it. And it probably maybe deserved an Ultra title if it was really dialed into their kit properly. And but it's a big no to monkey with that Windows brand. Now you're playing with not even fire. You're playing with an atom bomb there. That can blow up in your face.
The big dog. The big dog up and revving.
Bites.
They will bite. Yep, exactly. And then one other quick thing, I always find this funny, just because they're no longer supported. Windows XP and Server 23 did receive a patch recently to head off a wormable flaw, they called it, with some remote desktop services. The only reason I ever bring that up is because Microsoft told us for years and decades that XP and Server 2003 would never be patched after their serviceable life, and here they are.
Yes, right, exactly. Of course, there's more patching. Now, there was another one I read about too that I think is going to be in the next round of patches that's coming out, that is 7 and earlier. That applies to Windows 7 and earlier, client and server. It's called Blue something.
Oh yes, I remember hearing about this.
Blue Door or Blue Worm, I don't know. Anyway, validated exploitable. A little bit concerning, sort of, to me. Yeah. I don't know if you kind of feel this way, that the quantity of these verified exploits that they're patching that are there to be exploited, both in Windows and in client apps. Of course, I mean, Adobe and Flash is its own whole mess, but things like flaws in Word and sort of these everyday productivity apps that present some risk, not to mention IE and Edge and Windows itself. And I don't know, man. It's sort of, I don't know if we're getting better at finding them and we're being sensitized to it. I suspect that's part of it. But I also wonder if the release cadence has something to do with that too. And going back to the earlier conversation about sort of speed of this and all of that. Yes, the miracle of flight, but man, the downside risk of a problem. I don't know. A little concerning. And I guess the most important thing is the cautionary tale of the importance of keeping pace with this, right? Of staying up on it and not letting yourself and your organization get behind, because the risk is real, you know?
I mean, exploits are exploits. I guess it's good to see that Microsoft patches them. The thing that was running through my head is, well, how long will they keep patching Windows 7? And then the thought popped into my head that, hey, Microsoft recently said, I think it was at Build maybe, or sometime kind of behind the curtains, is, hey, we think about half of enterprise customers have upgraded to 10 already, which also means that half have not and need to do it by January. And while they're publicly not going to release the patches for free, we clearly see that they have set a precedence that if something's bad enough, it's going to get patched.
Yeah. You know, they don't want. There are a ton of cases where the problem is bad enough that the organizations that have to continue to run those really old operating systems are important enough customers that it's worth spending the dollars to fix it. Right. I mean, that's what it comes down to, that there is an audience that has a business reason to continue to use it. That business reason may have been created by limitations of those old Windows platforms that Microsoft engineered into it or didn't engineer out of it properly. And so those customers are stuck. You know, think about like a big radiology device or some of these specialized things that run on XP or something like that. And they're they gotta keep going with it, and they really need to be network connected for a bunch of reasons, and you know, whatever, on and on and on and on. And so yeah, there might be really good reasons for Microsoft to continue to do this. So I don't think we're at a reasonable risk of Windows 7 you know, seeing the end of its patch life for a while, especially for these kinds of critical issues.
I full-heartedly agree. I think it's going to be, Microsoft would love to tell you that everything is going to be fine on January 31st, but we all kind of know that's not going to be the case.
Right, and that's also why the new model of Windows 10 is part of the solution. Is that there's, you know, there is no more legacy. It's all one, and it's all moving forward together, and we have a way of enforcing that, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And I think it is a better way to go. It's not perfect either. And we live in our organizations with a particularly pronounced set of the challenges associated with that, trying to keep pace. And, you know, release to release, it is definitely not the same operating system. And that's why, you know, we have lots of advice around, you know, how to manage Windows based on the way that things go from H1 to H2 and H next forward. But yeah, it's sort of a tricky, slippery slope on all sides.
Yep, absolutely is. We'll be curious to see how that all shakes out. But Aaron, as we end it here, we always do a dish. I actually want, if you have anything else, please feel free to chime in. But I have a question about something in your background. What's the deal with the bike?
Oh. Yeah, so well, as you know, we've talked about cycling a little bit, right? Yep. I love riding bikes. I have a lot of bicycles. This one is a nice old Schwinn Speedster. It is beloved, and it is fully functional. It is fully functional and rideable. 3-speed internal hub. That is also still functional, a little sticky and tricky, but brakes work great. Good rubber on it. It's very fun. A little difficult to ride that kind of bike in Seattle. It's very, very hilly here. But that's one in what I'm not really a collecting kind of person. Yeah. I wouldn't say I have a bike collection, but it's starting, like the garage certainly starting to look like that. And this was here. And so some of the team said, "Oh, you should put it on the wall. It'd be so great." Yeah. And it's better here than in my garage, where it would see little use. And I get to enjoy it a little more here. So I commute a couple days a week on a bicycle as well. that is sort of new vintage. It's like a 1990s Italian cyclocross bike that's been refitted for riding around town, and that's fun. And yeah, it's that perfect time of year where it's still not too hot in Seattle, and it's dry enough now, especially because of the changing climate, that the riding is just awesome. So everyone should get out.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but I believe it's mounted on the wall, isn't it?
Yeah. I got on Etsy. I think they're available on Amazon too. A little kind of artistic mounting bracket. It's just a nice piece of walnut stained up, and the crossbar sits on that. So, a real hardcore site will say, "Oh well, that's not good for the cables, and you're going to scratch the frame and all this and that." But whatever. It's in a late '60s, early '70s. Big heavy steel Schwinn that's just gotten hammered over time, so I'm not worried about it resting on the cables there. But it's a very, very fun bike, and it's fun to have bikes. Like I love the simplicity of the bicycle. The fact that nothing on it requires batteries, right? And it's just you can know how it works just by looking at it.
Yep.
I love it.
Yeah, the only reason I brought that up is we just bought my daughter her first real bike. She had one little chintzy one, but she learned how to ride a bike about 3 weeks ago, and so for her birthday we got her a real proper bike. It's bright pink and she loves it. And then I saw the bike in the background. I was like, man, that's a nice little bike you got hanging up there.
Yeah, and so for a bike geek like me, the great thing about having children is you get to go bike shopping all the time. You're sort of on this treadmill, for better or worse, of bicycles, and we just had a great experience. My son is on a bigger bike now, and the shop that we buy from has this great trade-in program, but they didn't really have a bike that was suitable for how he rides and the way I take him riding. So we found one at a different shop, and worked out great. But now what do we do with his old bike? Enter the magic of two great sources, Craigslist, of course, and a website called Pink Bike. And I underpriced it slightly deliberately just because I wanted to get it out of the garage, and thought if someone really loves it, that'd be, as much a joy as the extra $50 or whatever I'd get from it. So, and I got an overwhelming response, and it was gone in, 36 hours from the time I posted it. So so that's a great little tip for the cyclists, including you, Brad, to keep an eye out for those sources. You can get a very, very good quality bike for next to nothing. That's like computers, a used computer you can get so cheap. Yeah. Not that we would be interested in that, but.
Yeah. No, I'm very picky about the components I now put in my machine, but that's only because I like to geek out on them. So you got anything else for us, Aaron, before we shut it down?
Watch those driver updates. They're coming in hot and fast. Could wreck your system on a printer driver.
Yeah, and that's always a fun one. That is always a fun one. Well, Aaron, we very much appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. And to everybody else, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. We'll be back in a couple weeks here with another episode. That wraps it up for today, if I could enunciate correctly. Have yourselves a wonderful weekend.